Thank you very much, Heath, and thank you for inviting us to speak to the Australian Institute for International Affairs ACT branch. It's a great pleasure to be with you all this evening. The subject of our book, Myanmar's Digital Coup, is, in a sense, got two parts to it. One, and that's hence the title, Digital. The first part talked how it's affected the transition that's taken place in Myanmar and how it's been used of it. The other part of the book is very much about how the international community has responded to the coup. So essentially we ask you in the book, what are we to make of how the international community has responded to Myanmar's coup? At the beginning, there was this flurry of statements coming from all sorts of countries, from ASEAN, from the United Nations, statements of concern about developments there, calling for peace. But none of these have had any effect on the commander-in-chief of Myanmar's armed forces who mounted the coup, a guy by the name of Min Aung Hlaing. It has shown total indifference and to world opinion. But this is perhaps not very surprising. I mean, this is a man who's shown complete indifference to the wishes of the people of Myanmar, who had just had an election which overwhelmingly voted for the National League for Democracy. International community. And these statements, as a result of that, have increasingly come to be seen as rather worthless, perhaps formulaic, and perhaps even, very performative. In my view, this is a partial and if not cynical interpretation of the value of these statements. We argue that Myanmar's military ignores them, even though they ignore them. They're relevant and they do serve a purpose. Most importantly, they draw attention to the situation that's taking place in Myanmar. I think that's their primary value. But they're helping to keep Myanmar in the spotlight, if you like. And this is important because the coup is not a one-off event. It is not something which just happened and now the military in charge and the military are running the country. It has been contested. It has been contested by the people of Myanmar in a way which they haven't contested the three previous coups that have taken place over the course of Myanmar's history. And the armed resistance is ongoing and evident in many parts of the country. The statements, by foreign governments are also important as an articulation of values and expected norms of international behavior. And the message here is not just for Myanmar, but for other potential coup leaders around the world, that the world is not just going to sit back and accept it. They are going to speak out about it. But, the impact of these statements of outrage may not be much, but, who would argue that staying silent in the face of the coup would be better? The resistance movement, however, feels that this signalling by the international community is insufficient, particularly when contrasted with the international response to the war in Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza. Early on, they wanted more than statements and called for intervention. They wanted a foreign intervention. They invoked the United Nations responsibility to protect doctrine. This is a rather ambitious request on their part and one that's very unlikely to be realized. The UN responsibility to protect doctrine allows for collective action to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, but only through the Security Council. And Russia and China, who are both veto-wielding members of the Security Council, have had a long history of protecting Myanmar from Security Council resolutions. There was, in December of 2022, pass a resolution on Myanmar. The first time that's ever passed a resolution on Myanmar. Support for ASEAN to resolve the conflict. But it fell short of even condemning the coup or imposing an arms embargo or referring the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court, for example. Nevertheless, it was the first Security Council resolution on the country. And this is significant because the UN has been preoccupied with Myanmar for decades. But only now, have Russia and China been willing to let Myanmar face the opprobrium of a Security Council resolution. So although a relatively weak resolution, it is a resolution the first time they've done it. The relationship between the UN and Myanmar has long been a fractious one. For over 30 years, the General Assembly, not the Security Council, the General Assembly has passed resolutions expressing concern at the human rights situation in the country, and numerous, nosy envoys and rapporteurs have been appointed to investigate various things. But there is this long-standing deep trust deficit between the UN system and Myanmar authorities, and it's on both sides. And this is evident in the inability of various UN fact-finding missions, well, evident in the fact that they're appointed, but also evident in the fact that they have often been denied opportunities to visit, and certainly been denied opportunities recently to even meet with Aung San Suu Kyi, who is currently in prison. What I think this means is that even if the military junta and the various resistance groups were willing to enter into some sort of dialogue with each other, I don't think the United Nations would be in a position where it would be a trusted partner for all the parties because of this long-standing antagonistic relationship. So we've got one Security Council resolution, umpteen General Assembly resolutions. We've got the UN General Assembly not agreeing to the military junta's appointment of a new ambassador to the United Nations, but allowing the previous guy who was there to stay there, and he switched sides. So he was appointed by Aung San Suu Kyi when she was foreign minister and state councillor. He switched to, if you like, he's retained his loyalty to National League for Democracy, and he's been able to hold his seat in the UN. So this is progress of sorts, but it's a lot less than what the people of Myanmar were calling for. And their initial hopes of a more muscular response from the United Nations just didn't really engage with the reality of a divided Security Council and that history of poor relations with the UN. So if the UN can't do much, what about ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations? Many countries, including Australia, really enthusiastically backing ASEAN as the party, the group that can help resolve the situation. In addition to itself issuing a few statements of concern about the situation there, in the early months after the coup, it convened a meeting of ASEAN leaders, and the Commander-in-Chief of Myanmar attended that. It produced what they call a 5-point consensus. And one of those points was an end to the violence and the start of a dialogue towards finding a peaceful solution. But this hasn't happened. And as a result of that, the fact that the Commander-in-Chief, on returning to Myanmar, ignored everything that he had committed to, as a result of that, ASEAN leaders have decided that he, the Commander-in-Chief, should not attend and represent Myanmar at ASEAN leaders' meetings, and also that the Foreign Minister of Myanmar shall not attend ASEAN Foreign Minister meetings. Now, ASEAN's nevertheless come in for a lot of criticism, that it's being ineffectual, hasn't achieved anything much beyond the appointment of a special envoy. And some people attribute this to ASEAN's principles of non-interference in the internal affairs of member states, and also its tradition of consensus decision-making. And according to this point of view, it's very much in ASEAN's DNA to not be, to be ineffectual in a sense. But we argue in the book, we take a different approach. We think ASEAN has achieved much more than it's been given credit for. So even though the consensus has been ignored, it has served a useful purpose. It's the regime's failure to live up to that consensus that has led ASEAN to suspend, the guy who claims to be the leader of the country from participating in ASEAN leaders meetings and from ASEAN foreign minister meetings. So it's that failure, which is the excuse, if you like, that ASEAN has lent on to impose these punitive measures. And, this is unprecedented. ASEAN hasn't responded to developments in any other of its member states, when there have been coups or other adverse developments at all. So it is quite a remarkable thing given the context of ASEAN. In a book, moving on now, in our book, we also look at the efficacy of targeted sanctions and the pressure on companies to cease doing business with Myanmar. Now, the sanctions imposed by some countries, including Australia, target the military-controlled entities and some businesses and individuals linked to the regime. These efforts also haven't been very effective, and for several fairly clear reasons. First, they're not UN-mandated sanctions, so they're not being applied universally. But secondly, the countries imposing the sanctions actually don't do much business with Myanmar, so there really isn't much leverage there. And there is very little history of Western companies being in joint venture or doing business with military-controlled businesses in Myanmar. Many of the businesses in Myanmar are the legacy of military-owned, including beer making, hotels, transport, and many other things. But nevertheless, we find that much of Western NGO activism following the coup is focused on multinational companies. And yet some of this has had unintended consequences. Oil and gas operations, for example, which are seen as one of the principal sources of foreign exchange for the Myanmar military regime. Pressure on companies has led to Chevron and to Total to walk away from their operations in Myanmar. And in walking away, they just gifted their proportion, their shareholding in those enterprises to the other shareholders, which includes the Myanmar government. So Myanmar government's share of these oil and gas operations increased and its revenues increased. And this has come about as a result of pressure on companies to exit, thinking that that's somehow going to cut revenues to the military. So it's an example of a perverse outcomes. And, European labour unions are calling on fashion brands to cease ordering from Myanmar garment factories. It's a big industry in Myanmar. And many of them have ceased placing their orders with Myanmar factories. And, this has led to tens of thousands of Myanmar workers losing their jobs. And these are primarily women from poor parts of the country who have moved to Yangon in particular to work in these factories. And they're very vulnerable to now being abused and to being exploited in many other ways. So we argue that it would probably be beneficial for Myanmar for foreign companies to stay in the country, and they're much more likely to uphold environmental standards, human rights standards, workers' rights than the cronies that who are left who are filling the gaps. So our motivation in writing this book is quite simple. There's a lot of concern about what's happening in the country, and we all want to do something about it. But we argue that too much of the focus has been on what agents outside the country are doing, what the United Nations is doing, what ASEAN's doing, criticism of that, criticism of multinational businesses. And our conclusion very much is that, if you really want to do more, we need to focus more on supporting the agents of change that are in Myanmar itself. And many citizens in Myanmar have withdrawn their children from government schools. Many teachers and doctors have stopped working for government service providers. Many people live in areas no longer serviced by the military-controlled government agencies. And, we need to think about how we can do more to help these people and how we can help the resistance movement. And I'm not venturing into helping the resistance movements through supplying weapons and things of that sort, but in terms of providing services, health, education, law and justice in areas which are under the control of the resistance organizations. So I think I should leave it at that. I hope I haven't gone on for too long and pass it on to Lennon.
Thanks, Nicholas. Well, you never let diplomat talks because they'll talk hours and hours. No, I'll be short. No, but thanks, Nicholas, for outlining what the book is about. I'm more talking about Nick is talking about the international responses to the Myanmar coup. My focus is more on to my observation during the time when I was in Myanmar working on cyberbaking. Cyberbaking, well, I might pronounce the word wrong, but it is baking in Burmese. Refers to safety, so it's more like cyber safety program. It was founded by DFAT and was at the time working with the government, the Aung San Suu Kyi government and industry people, colleagues on cybersecurity awareness raising. And this links to the reason why I think it's interesting to talk about Myanmar's digital coup and compare it with the previous coup in the past. And I believe you agree with me that the coup in 2021 is very different to the ones in, say, 2007 or even 1988, which was run by the monks or university students. The coup in 2021 are supported by a group of people who actually grew up with technologies. So they have a good understanding of technology. Technology has been developed in Myanmar in the past decades, which it was very low access to a very high access at the moment. And just give you a little bit of background on that, we see in 2011, there are only 1%, less than 1% of the people in Myanmar have internet access, and only 2% of people who got access to the mobile phone. And during those time, of course, we can understand the mobile phone, the SIM card is owned by the state, Myanmar Post and Telecommunications. The subscribers are usually under surveillance of the government. So even if they are using that, they'll be very cautious about it. I was talking to some of the participants today. Give a guess, if you were in Myanmar in 2009, how much would you spend to buy a SIM card? Well, money-wise, time is another issue, yes. How much do we spend to buy a SIM card now here in Australia? Get a SIM card, just a SIM card without data. $2? And what do you think, how much would you pay to buy a SIM card in Myanmar back in 2009? All right, I won't waste a lot of time here. It was the cost was 2,000 USD to buy a SIM card back in 2009 in a very poor country. Well, Nick will be able to talk about that. Yes. I wasn't there at the time, but I was surprised to hear that because back in 2009, we all have our SIM card and it's almost free. But with the opening up of the market in 2014, with all the international company coming in, including Telenor, Orido, and now Mattel, the SIM card is more cheaper than what we get here in Australia. And I can tell you, when I was in Myanmar, the internet is much cheaper and stable than what we have here in Australia. So that's the situation back in between 2009 to the development in 2018, and you can probably see with all the new development of technology, everyone is on the internet, and you probably have a understanding like a lot of people on Facebook, you'll probably hear that in Myanmar, everyone is on Facebook believe everything that has been said on Facebook, and it's because at the time, well, there's something good. Well, I shouldn't say good, but smart of Facebook is they just during the development of the new technologies, when Myanmar people buy a new phone, they have the Facebook apps installed in the phone, and they can use it for free without costing them any data. So a lot of people actually buy the phone, have a very limited data, but they can use the Facebook for free. So they are on Facebook all the time. So Facebook to Myanmar people, when I was there back in 2018, it is the internet. So everything that people mention on Facebook are the things that very much like what we go Google now. So you'll see the Facebook has facilitated both the dissemination of the message and of course gathering the information for the citizens, and it definitely become a very important tools during the coup, as when we see within the hours of the coup, the Facebook was a Facebook post issued the National League for Democracy, simply believed drafted by Aung San Suu Kyi in anticipation of her arrest, called on supporters to protest the coup. So hundreds of people, when they read this message, they took on the streets spontaneously, and then they tried to voice out against the detention of the president, the state councilor Aung San Suu Kyi, and other politicians and civil activists. And not long after that, we see that's a hashtag civil disobedience movement campaign started by the citizens in Myanmar to oppose or disapprove the digital coup. And we see if you're closely watching the news during this period of time, they have a campaign. Everyone will out on the streets banning pots and pans at 8 p.m. So it's also a message has been disseminated through Facebook and other social medias to encourage people to voice out against the coup. While the technology has been used by the activists or by Myanmar people in fighting against the coup, of course, we can see the military junta is also using the technology as a way to do surveillance or control the local people. One of the things we usually see is they lower down the internet speed. Of course, what I was saying is that I try to reduce the dissemination of misinformation, disinformation, but also at the same time they try to reduce the dissemination of those messages, the campaigns out to the local people. The other way they usually use is internet shutdown. So they just shut down all the internet and don't allow people to use the internet. So that while during the COVID time we have a restriction not to go out after 8 p.m. and between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. in Myanmar, they have the restriction on using the internet during that period of time, and it is still the same in Myanmar in some of the areas, or especially when some events happens. The other, apart from the internet shutdown, apart from the low of the speed, the use of CCTV has become a big concern during those period of time. A lot of people argue that the CCTV during was installed starting from Aung San Suu Kyi's government for the safety and security of the country, but it's been used as a way to control or doing surveillance on the activists. So these are the new how technology has been facilitating the anti-coup citizens activists, but also been used by the government in banning or prohibiting or stopping the youth coup. One of the things I would like to mention, I know I'm sort of running out of time, is the use of doxing by the activists in shaming and naming the military people or the police. I know if you in Australia, we already have a law on banning doxing. We don't allow people to do the public shaming or dig out other people's personal information. But during this period of time, during the coup, it seems to be a way to fight against the military junta and try to cause some fear or deterrence against those political the junta people, or try to use this as a pressure to force those military people not to kill the local people. And this is not only thing in Myanmar. We also see what we call the Milk Alliance. We see people in Hong Kong doing the similar things. We see in Taiwan, in India, they are all using the same way of doing it. So what we're thinking about when we're talking about doxing as a banning doxing fully might not be the way to go. Sometimes it can be done in the right or good position. Well, I think I'll stop it here, but maybe Nick will talk about other things, but maybe in the discussion we can touch on the new cybersecurity law as well. It got passed earlier this year, and it got what they call implemented in mid 2025. They got few things for continuing the junta in doing surveillance or control on the local people. Thank you.
Thanks, Lennon. I don't know if your situation is like mine, but as someone who's worked on Myanmar for many years, but wasn't an ambassador there, didn't have that fortune, I'm often asked why or how it was they got interested in the country. Why do you work in Myanmar? And depending on who I'm talking to, I have different answers to that question. But one of the answers I sometimes give is they had an old school buddy, a high school buddy who was from Myanmar. And I remembered him today when I was making notes in preparation for this discussion, because he had the curious characteristic of always carrying around with him in his top pocket a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And maybe it's an opportunity for some dark humor, replace it with the Bible and that idea of, like, the UDHR stop the bullets and say human rights saved my life. But the reason I was thinking about it was because when asked why, he would say that, well, you never know when you might need it. And it seemed to me that he's somehow embodying something of the affect of the demonstrators in the first days and weeks after the coup that we hear about in the opening chapters of your book, who are making these appeals through English language signage, sometimes by writing, some of you may have seen them, by writing these enormous painted signs along streets in cities and towns around the country, which were captured on Google Earth. And for months afterwards, you could go on to Google and just like scan over large towns in Myanmar and find these enormous statements like written out from one length of a street to the next. Where is UN? Or like, we want action now. We want UN intervention. All of these statements. And I was thinking about my old buddy and then reflecting on these events and these statements and thinking, one way of approaching them, and I think there's a little bit of this in your book, but not much, is to suggest that there's a kind of naivety there. And of course, certainly there is, right? We can all scoff and say, well, it's ridiculous for anyone who knows anything at all about the international system. It's a non-starter. But another way of thinking about it is to say that there's an attempt here to hail international institutions, to hail international norms and say, we know of these things and we're watching, and we're going to hold international institutions to account. We're going to be able to observe what is the gap between facts and norms. And it's not something which is going to be forgotten. So I think that while, as in all situations like this, we encounter an admixture of people, some who would be very sincere in their attempts to get, blue helmets and boots onto the streets as soon as possible. There were many others that I think that this was part of what you're writing about, the digital strategy, the manner in which this was a remarkable digital coup, precisely because of the opportunities that it presented to hail, to communicate immediately through internet technologies to people internationally and say, here we are, this is the situation that we're going through, and we want some type of reaction, and if we don't get it, we're going to take note. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. That go to very much to how you set up the book, and I really appreciate how you set up the book and why this book is important, because one of the first things you say is that while this question of how the world responded is important, and Nicholas, you addressed this point in your comments, in a way it's a subsidiary question. It's relevant in as much as we ask the question, how did people in Myanmar themselves respond? And in as much as in that hailing exercise, immediately people in Myanmar observe, well, we get no response at all, or we get a response that's totally inadequate in comparison to the scale of the atrocities and the demands that we're setting for the international community. That then sets the terms for the political actions on the ground that follow. How we move quickly, very quickly, from all of that mobilization on the streets in February and March of 2021 to the organizing of armed opposition through April, May, and June, through the establishment of the National Unity Government within such a short period of time. That also is all mediated through new technologies, through internet communications and so on. But it partly comes by virtue of this question and answer approach to how does the world respond? Well, not very well in our estimation. What are the alternatives? The alternatives have to be alternatives that we come up with ourselves, that they have to be right here in front of us. This is not a situation in which we can wait. And we can't pretend that the world does not know, as say in the case of 1988 or earlier periods in which military coups occurred. Everyone knew perfectly well that that's what the situation is. So there's a technological dimension here, which Lennon, you were alluding to really well. And also, Nicholas, as you were alluding to, that political dimension, both of which I think are enfolded really well in the book. Now, one thing that I want to pick up on to sort of contextualize those events, which I think you address in the book, but I would have liked to have seen some more of, is that the history of digital mediation of politics in Myanmar is a short and violent history. You really date it from around 2014, when we have the multinational corporations first getting the opportunity to enter quite freely into the telecommunications sector. But let's not forget that Facebook, about which we've already heard from Lennon, played a prominent part in the Islamophobic Buddhist nationalist organizing from 2012 and the atrocities of 2012 and 2013 that anticipated genocide in 2017. So Facebook is there from that point already, from 2011, 2012. And it came in, and those events occurred in Myanmar at exactly the time, or just in the wake of many of the Arab uprisings. The Arab Spring is going on. The tech bros and all of their ego inflators are going around the place congratulating themselves on what a brilliant thing platforms are for democracy. And then Myanmar screws the story up massively. Of course, many other places have screwed it up since. What we start to learn is that that is not, in fact, the situation that we encounter on these platforms. But at the time, Myanmar was one of the first and most striking cases where it was obvious that the work of algorithms made genocide possible. Now, one of the things you point to in the book, which is really good, is the attention to questions of digital literacy. And this problem that because of the very short period of time in which these technologies, these platforms were present in Myanmar, and as you alluded to, Lennon, everything was Facebook from the get-go. Because of that, people were easy targets for all kinds of online misinformation, disinformation, doxing, and other practices that you were alluding to. And to some extent, I agree. And all of these practices you show, I think, very well, very thoroughly carry over into the revolutionary situation, and they carry over into the practices both of the revolutionaries, as you alluded to, but also the counter-revolutionaries, right? The shaming and doxing of the family members of civil disobedience movement participants, the use, remarkably, and here we see a fascinating sort of intertextuality, if I'm allowed to drop into academic jargon for a moment, intertextuality between what's going on online and traditional media, where, for instance, the state newspapers are announcing who has arrest warrants out against them using profile pictures from Facebook. Right? So this slippage of the digital world into the traditional media world is going on as well. And so this is all sort of overtaking what's happening at that time. And to my mind, a lot of it goes back to what was happening from 2012, 2013 onwards, precisely because at that time also the state media was learning how to do exactly these things. So, you know, low digital literacy in that context, I think, explains some things. But I think one thing I might have liked to have seen more about in the book, and it goes to points I just made already, is of course the part that the structures of these platforms had in making it so, right? You talk a lot about weaponization of the internet, and I think in some cases and in some circumstances that's appropriate. But another way to put it would be to say, is it redundant to weaponize a weapon, right? I mean, in as much as we now understand that a lot of these platforms are designed algorithmically in order to monetize traffic, in order to move as many eyeballs through as possible in a way that they really don't need to be weaponized. That's what they're set up to do from the outset, right? And therefore, under these circumstances, while agency is playing a part, I think we need to attend to the role that structure is playing. And I ask this partly because one thing I'd really like to hear more from you about, Lennon especially, is what you think is the next thing that's going to happen now that we have all of this synthetic media machinery coming on board, popularly known as AI. We have the reported imminent death of platforms. Google Zero, I've been learning about just in recent days. Anyone who doesn't know about that, ask the expert. You know, I'm starting to think we might need a second edition of the book rather sooner than you were planning to put one out in order to answer some of these questions. But these are all live thoughts in my mind that came up after reading it. Let me turn briefly from the online world to a couple of other points, and then I'll stop, noting colleagues and everyone listening that we are running short on time. So weapons were proliferating online, but then weapons also were proliferating, being manufactured, being moved around the place in the physical world as well from the middle of 2021, in the world of flesh and blood, of bullets and barricades, and of course, helicopters, and in 2025, drones. And Nicholas, you made the point that, you know, both in the book and also you were alluding to it in your remarks, that the NUG has been successful, or like political opponents of the regime have been successful in advancing their case a certain way and making a strong case that they deserve to be recognized as legitimate government. But you express some skepticism about that in the book, or let's say there's a gentle critique of that in the book. And one of the reasons that you point to is that, well, while NUG and its allies have made a lot of progress in getting control of some parts of the country, major cities and central areas of the country are still under control of the military junta, the apparatus of the conventional military state machinery, and so on. And that makes it hard then for partners potentially of the NUG or its allies to get involved in, say, making commitments to them to sort of treat them as a preferential partner for humanitarian aid delivery or other activities that may deepen the relationship between them and the international community. And again, at some level, I'm in agreement with that. But then I sort of started tugging on some of the threads that were in my mind that came from your argument around this being a digital coup. And I thought, still, does that omit some of the ways in which this also is a really new situation because of how it continues to be digitally mediated? If we think about sort of sovereignty and statecraft and state power and this sort of kind of Hobbesian Commonwealth territory, bodies, movement, control, then I think we're missing a huge amount of what's going on, not only in terms of the armed conflict in Myanmar, but also in terms of service delivery, in terms of new ideas about governance, about legitimacy, about social control. Now, that all sounds rather abstract, but you know, to allude to something that was mentioned already, sort of delivery of health services or delivery of legal services. If we take, you know, delivery of health services, for instance, we see now, you know, it's possible for revolutionary medical workers to coordinate and move themselves over huge tracts of territory in Myanmar today without the types of traditional control of territory, without the kinds of traditional medical facilities that they once had, or that we might associate with a health system proper, or even in areas that are firmly under the control of established armed groups. And that being the case, doesn't it invite us to rethink what it means to talk about a health system in this context, and therefore what it means to talk about the delivery of public services through states or state-like institutions, and open up ways of getting into dialogue, another key term for the book, that would allow us then to work through other possibilities. And I ask this question, not to be sort of trying to sound theoretical, but precisely because it has implications for the delivery and politics of humanitarian aid, which is, as Nicholas already referred to, a major subject of the book. So if we take off our old-fashioned seeing like a state glasses, let's say, I'm not going to take mine off because I won't be able to see my notes, and instead accept the invitation to look at what happened since the coup is digitally mediated, then we might see that actually a lot of these public services that are going out, whether through NUG or its allies or through other armed groups or coordinated in various ways, have greater reach, are better resourced, involved more skilled people, and are more effective at humanitarian aid delivery and the supply of medical support in emergency situations than anything else that exists in the country. And if that's the case, I'm not saying that it is, but I'm saying, like, suppose that's the case. I think there is evidence to support it. You've read it. You've cited it in the book, work by people like Anne Decobur at the University of Melbourne and others. If that's the case, then what kind of moral imperatives does that put on international aid agencies, on governments like the government of Australia, or perhaps the government of the Philippines, to consider how it might coordinate and engage for the purposes of the delivery of humanitarian aid in these ways differently from the past? That also has flow-on effects, of course, for them, what we do and what we think about when it comes to the National Unity Government and other political actors. I was kind of hoping Dr. Tunong Shui, the representative, would be with us this evening, but regret to see that he isn't. But you're also critical, I think, to some degree rightly, of NUG's kind of dogged pursuit of political recognition. For a couple of reasons, at that point, the governments recognize states, not other governments, and also because, it's not an either-or proposition. I think you argue this very well in the book, right? The Australian government, let's say, can use its embassy in Myanmar to organize humanitarian aid, gather information and represent Australia's interests without legitimating the junta. The people there are smart enough, they know what they're doing to manage that well. And it can also have supportive relations, or the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade can do that with the NUG without needing to give it formal recognition. Okay, fine, that's how the argument goes, and that makes sense. And yet if the NUG and its allies might be viewed as engaging in a different form of sovereign practice from that we're accustomed to thinking about, and that we see when we look at the military junta, then again, might there not be other ways in which we would think about how we could engage with them diplomatically? I'm going to ask that as an open question because I'm one of perhaps a few diplomats, a few non-diplomats with Lennon in the room. There are others here who have better ideas. But it seems to me from observation, and very recent observation, that there are always exceptions, as it were, to the diplomatic rule, conditions in which for principled reasons or for practical reasons, some consideration can be given to specific circumstances that might mean that the kinds of recognition that would not ordinarily be extended could be. And I'm reminded of the keynote speech that the former Thai Foreign Minister, Surikiat Sathyanthai, gave to us earlier in the year here in Canberra, when he said that the Australian government specifically, that he thought it had many more opportunities to do this sort of work, that it didn't need to be always working through ASEAN in the way that it continues to do, and that if the Australian government was prepared to engage more autonomously and deliberately, say, with various actors on and around the situation in Myanmar, then that might actually prompt ASEAN to act in a bolder way than it has done thus far, notwithstanding acknowledgement of your point that you think that, in fact, more has happened in that space than many other commentators and observers suggest. Two very quick points before closing. I can put them on the table, and maybe we'll just have to take the conversation up later. But I really enjoyed reading the book and want to ask these questions for that reason. So in this regard, in regard to that last point, I note right at the end of the book that you say that, quote, ASEAN needs to maintain its current strategy of isolating the leader of the junta, Min Aung Hlaing, while engaging at other levels with the regime. And, we sort of got to say, well, so much for that suggestion, right, in view of what's happened in 2025. But still, I think that there are possibilities to think through the implications of the current situation and how the Australian government, among others, might engage differently. And in particular, to do that in the context that we're now in, that we know at the end of the year, in all likelihood, there will be something going under the name of an election. Right? And here also, at the very end of the book, in regards to the election, you ask yourselves, this is in the middle of 2024 when the book was published, so I assume you're writing early 2024 or sometime in 2023, you ask, would a flawed process and a compromised outcome in the election be better or worse than the status quo? And I'd be keen to hear your answer to that question right now in the middle of 2025. Thank you.
Thanks very much to our speakers. We might give Nicholas and Lennon 5 minutes before to contend to some of the questions that Nick put, perhaps, if you wish. And then we'll open up with about 10 minutes to the floor.
I'm happy to go overtime as well if people don't have things to run off to, if that's permissible. Okay, I'll try and speak quickly then, more quickly than I did before. Just make a general. Countries and including Australia can engage with all the actors, and indeed we make this point in the book. It's not this formal statement of recognizing governments. I mean, you can go on the DFAT's website, you won't see any formal statement, recognizing the government of New Zealand, for example. It's just not a done practice. But, often there might be, letters of congratulation. There'll be meetings between leaders. There'll be parliamentary visits. There'll be defense cooperation. There'll be all sorts of cooperation. So countries indicate their attitudes to other governments through their behavior. And in a sense, that is the form of recognition rather than a formal one. And the point we make in the book is the National Unity Government, that's the government formed essentially by the National League for Democracy and are in exile, is, for over 4 years has been seeking some statements of formal recognition. And, the criticism that we're making of it, gently, but I do hold it more strongly, but I put it more gently in the book, is that, it's wasting its time. What it needs to be doing is having relations with all sorts of entities, and drawing others to them. And the provision of health and education through these various methods, is one way of doing that. And the more they do that, and the argument is the more they behave like a government, the more they will be treated like a government. What that will mean with a junta in control of the commercial capital Yangon, the political capital Naypyidaw, and the cultural capital of Mandalay. But there are large parts of the territory that the military do not have command over. So it would become more of a hybrid types of relationships. That's all within the realms of possibility, but I don't feel that that's been grasped by the NUG. Just by the way, the other hat I wear is the Australian Myanmar Institute. We put on monthly webinars, and on the last Monday of every month. The one not coming up next week, but in September, will be on the ways that healthcare and medicine is being delivered using technology, telemedicine and all sorts of things like that in many parts of the country. So that might be of interest to many here. In relation to Nick's final point about the elections, and is it going to be better or worse? I do think it's a binary choice. It's not like saying, well, National League of Democracy won 5 years ago unambiguously. They are the government of Myanmar. That's what it should be. Yes, agree with that, but the reality is there is going to be an election, and the outcome of that will be, it'll be a compromised election, it'll be a flawed election. It won't be in all parts of the country. It has many political parties aren't being allowed to participate. You know, it's compromised. But the question I ask is, will that be a better outcome than the military commander continuing to rule? And I think the answer has got two parts to it. On the one part, it's diluting the commander-in-chief, the dictator's power, because he will either become president and then there'll be a commander-in-chief, or he'll remain commander-in-chief. I mean, he's got to win the election. I mean, it's rigged. He'll remain commander-in-chief and appoint some compliant person as president and try and... But I think with the passage of time under that sort of arrangement, you know, there are multiple people in every society, in every organization, from the smallest to the largest, who want power, who want control. And, you know, this guy doesn't have a monopoly on that kind of ambition. There will be others out there. And I think he's ultimately will be diluting his power. So that's the plus side of it. You know, this could go on for a long time before we saw any consequences. That's a marginal plus to it. The downside is it's a pretext which neighboring countries in particular will use to step up their relationship with the military regime. And that's, I think, bound to happen. When you're a country bordering another country, and you know your border is in some cases more than 2,000 kilometers, and it's a land border, and you have a conflict going on in Myanmar, and you have irregular migration on a scale which, you know, Australia has never seen, yet still gets quite worked up about, where you have organized crime, you know, the world's largest producer of opium, where you have scam centers employing thousands of people who have been trapped and are then being used to defraud your own citizens, like Chinese people. You know, these are very real issues. When you have disturbances on your border and you're the government in that neighboring country, you need to engage with the other side, and some pretext to enable some step up in that engagement is one you'll take. So it's a plus and a minus. Questions? Oh,
well, told you not to let diplomats speak. I'll be very quick. I'm not a typical academic. I really like the what Nick just mentioned about why do we need to weaponize the weapon. But to me, technology shouldn't be a weapon. So it should be. It can be a double-edged sword, but it shouldn't be used in that way. And I also agree it would be a good topic for the next book, but it can be a whole academic career as well. As I've been working on the influence of human factor of cybersecurity, the impact of new technologies. We do see it's been used in a different way, not only in Myanmar, like we see in Taiwan, the dissemination and disinformation and the use of AI. And this is exactly what we're expecting to see in during the election at the end of this year. How it'll be very interesting to really do a case study on how technology being used in disseminating disinformation and generating AI in order to facilitate certain candidates and get the result into the direction that they want. And also back to your one of your queries, yes, we are. One sentence I used when I was running the cybersecurity campaign in Myanmar. One sentence I usually use is, we are expecting someone who start to learn to crawl to fly, because we're expecting them to have the same cybersecurity awareness or cybersecurity skills like what we have, but we forget they don't even know how to protect their password. And even protecting password is against their culture. So this is the cultural issues that we mentioned in the other paper, not in this book. Maybe we can send it to you later. But there are a lot of elements there that we need to take into consideration. And the other thing is the use of Cybersecurity Act. I'm sometimes thinking about why they passed the act earlier this year, and then coming to force in mid 2025. I wonder if it's getting ready for the election as well, because the Cybersecurity Act has been there for a very long time, since the time when I was doing my research and the activities in Myanmar. Although it has been changed quite a bit, and of course it'll be at the moment being interpreted into in supporting the junta, but the majority, I believe the majority of the act is now really different. Last but not least, back to the Facebook issues. Yes, we see back in, like Nick was saying, back in 2011, 2012, we see Facebook being blamed as supporting genocide. And Facebook at the time starting to put a lot of Burmese people who can speak Burmese to do the filtering or censorship. And then after the junta take over the position, they start to say, well, see, Facebook is helping the junta to filter all the information that the people don't want to see. So it's a difficulties here. I'm not saying this in support of Facebook or any social media, but it's very back to the doxing issues, whether we want to give the social media the power on doing this kind of things, or should it be a more like back to the human rights or more global principles in regulating the filtering or the censorship on social media might be another issue, and it would be probably hundreds of theses can be produced from ANU. Thank you.
Got time for one question, then we'll have to wrap up. I don't think we've ever run full time with just the topic, but it's been so interesting tonight. It's been well worthwhile. So we'll take right here in the front for our last question of the evening.
Thank you. Thank you for the panel. I've heard more about Myanmar this evening in the last hour than I've heard all year. More to the point, or perhaps to illustrate the point, 30 odd years ago, I was the number 2 in the Defence Intelligence Organisation. Myanmar at that time was screaming out for attention. I could not make a single individual available to man some sort of Myanmar desk. Now, that's 30 odd years ago. Clearly, since then, we've got a lot more access, a lot more information, but gives rise, in my mind, to 2 questions. Is what we currently know adequate? And if it is, do we have enough financial resources to continue to make a meaningful contribution?
Well, one very important and very large part of Myanmar is the armed forces of Myanmar, and we know virtually nothing about them. And getting, even while I was there as ambassador, having access was very limited. But people make guesses about the size of the military in Myanmar. The big gaps in knowledge. That's the primary area of the country in which is very important to know something about, but we don't. Of resources. Well, it's a reasonably significant aid program in which is one aspect of it. In terms, when times were better, I mean, we were encouraging universities to engage. So the new Colombo plan, for example, Lennon brought groups from his university up to Myanmar as a part of study tours. We had Australian volunteer program, and that's all come to an end. we had a reasonably, there's a middle-sized embassy in terms of staffing of both local staff and diplomatic staff. It was, I thought, adequate for the importance of the country to Australia. But with the coup, and we're not having engagement with the military authorities, the numbers have shrunk. The travel warning for Myanmar is do not travel. The major Australian investments have pulled out. It's ANZ Bank, which got the first foreign banking license there. Woodside, which had very large offshore gas exploration, has walked away from they weren't in production, but from their exploration areas. They were the two big Australian investments. So a lot of that commercial connections has also gone. So that also means there's less knowledge and awareness as well. And there's no.
Well, I think that's I would say when I brought students to Myanmar, that's back in 2015 when the time Myanmar is opening up, the university still had the sense saying that, well, why do you want to bring students to that dangerous country, and why do you want to go and support the military government? And even some, when I got the New Campbell plan, bring students to Myanmar for the study tour, there are actually a student campaign against that, saying that Monash, I was say Monash at the time, is supporting genocide. They try to call of all the study tour not to engage with Myanmar. But one thing I feel grateful is when my students go there, I let them to really get in contact with local people, understanding what is happening in Myanmar. They come up with a totally different ideas about Myanmar, and they understand why when we're talking about sanctions, it might not work. When we're talking about more people to people connections important, and these are the things I think that has been missing in most of the general public. I don't blame Australian government for. I said there are too many focus that Australian government is focusing on, and whether Myanmar is on the top priority or origin coming from Taiwan, whether Taiwan is becoming the top priority, and it become media attention that really talk about all these events in certain countries would be something that might cause to general public's ideas about certain countries. At the moment, that I don't think there are any big events more serious than, say, Ukraine, Russia, U.S. issues. Media won't focus on that. At the same time, the resources will go into that because it won't be drawing the media attention or the local attention. Even if during the election, when we're talking about Myanmar, no one cares. But we're talking about Palestine, Israel, or even now China issues, you might get more voters to focus on the issues. So I think it is more whether it's becoming a hot topic at the moment or not. And the other issue is that whether there are a group of people who are trying to push it up to the front, and that people really understand what is happening in Myanmar at the moment, not just taking attention to them when that's when the coup happens or when there's a big earthquake, big events during the period of time.